Welcome to Voice of Stories. Discover tales that inspire, captivate, and bring words to life. Subscribe for unforgettable stories.
Tyler Hayes chewed the last bit of his sandwich, the stale bread scraping against his tongue like sandpaper. It was a pathetic lunch, but what else could he afford? At 22 years old, this was his life now, sitting in a grimy break room, surrounded by the smell of stale cigarettes and broken dreams. Overhead, the flickering fluorescent lights seemed to mock him, casting a cold, harsh glow on his solitude. Unit 30, where the hell are you? The dispatcher's grating voice crackled through the old radio. Tyler winced at the sound. A pickup waiting at the industrial district. Move it. The voice was sharp, impatient. Tyler sighed, wrapping up the remainder of his sandwich. Another day, another dollar. Except the dollars were getting fewer and farther between. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen better days. Growing up in Portland's foster system had never given him a head start in life. "Coming, Jerry," he called back, pulling on his worn leather jacket. ETA 5 minutes. The walk to his taxi felt heavier with every step. His car, number 37, sat in its usual spot, its paint chipped and its chrome tarnished by years of neglect. It was more rust than car at this point, but it was all he had. "Sorry, old girl," he muttered, running a hand over the hood. "Howard's too cheap to fix you properly." The engine coughed to life reluctantly, its groans matching the weariness in his bones. Tyler pulled out of the depot and saw Howard Mitchell watching him from the office window, his gaze sharp and critical. "Better than being stuck here," Tyler muttered, more to himself than anyone else, as he steered the creaking vehicle toward the industrial district. He checked the fuel gauge, barely a quarter of a tank. Howard had been cutting corners for months, forcing drivers to stretch their fuel as far as possible. At least the suspension wasn't completely shot, he thought, dodging yet another pothole. Just mostly shot. As he drove, Tyler caught a glimpse of his reflection in the cracked rear-view mirror. His tired eyes stared back at him, dark circles marking the toll long shifts and too little sleep had taken. 37, what's your 20? The radio crackled again. Just past the Miller factory, Tyler responded, squinting through the dirty windshield. Almost there, Jerry. Tell the fare to hold their horses. What Tyler didn't know was that this routine pickup would be the turning point of his life. The screech of tires on wet asphalt made him jerk the wheel to the right, his heart leaping into his throat as he narrowly avoided hitting a woman who had appeared out of nowhere in front of his taxi. "Jesus Christ!" Tyler shouted, throwing open the door and rushing out. His hands were shaking from the adrenaline. "Are you trying to get yourself killed?" The words caught in his throat as he saw her for the first time. A woman in a faded prison jumpsuit, a checkered headscarf covering her hair. Despite her shabby appearance, there was something in her eyes that made Tyler freeze. Desperation. Fear. Something he recognized all too well. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I need to get to First National Bank. It's important, and please." Tyler hesitated. She looked like trouble. Prison escapee, pregnant, probably dangerous. But there was something in those wide, desperate eyes that reminded him of the lost kid he used to be. The one who just needed someone to care. "Look," he said, softening his tone. "I'm already late for a pickup, and you probably don't have any money." "I'll pay," she interrupted, almost pleading. "Please, I just need to get there. I can't explain everything, but it's important." Tyler hesitated for a moment, glancing at his car. Howard would have his head if he found out. But then he saw the woman, her fragile, trembling form, and something in him shifted. "Get in," he said, already knowing he'd regret it. "No charge, I'm headed that way anyway." Her face lit up, and Tyler swore it was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "Thank you," she breathed, rushing to the door. As they drove, Tyler couldn't help but glance at her in the rearview mirror. Despite her ragged clothes, there was something about the way she held herself, a quiet dignity that spoke of better days. She wasn't just any runaway, she was someone who had been through a lot. "How long?" Tyler asked, his voice low. 3 years, she replied, her hand subconsciously moving to her belly, protective. I was framed. It should have been 0. Tyler frowned. Sometimes it's true, he said, thinking of kids he'd known in the foster system, railroaded by bad luck and the system's indifference. They drove in silence for a while, the old taxi's suspension creaking beneath them. As they neared the imposing marble facade of the First National Bank, Tyler pulled up to the curb. Last stop, he said, his voice softening. Whatever you're planning. Sophia hesitated, her hand on the door handle. She looked at him, her expression softer than before. I will. And Tyler, thank you again. You don't know what this means. She gave him one last smile, the kind that could melt a heart, and disappeared into the marble building. Tyler sat in the cab for a long moment, his thoughts swirling. Something told him this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. A few days later, Tyler stood in the taxi depot, watching Howard Mitchell's face turn purple with rage as he waved a report in front of him. You've been running your own charity service, haven't you, Hayes? Howard sneered. Unauthorized stops, excessive mileage, fuel discrepancies. Tyler stood tall, fighting the urge to lash out. Those were legitimate stops, he said, his voice steady. Howard's eyes narrowed, the cruel smile on his face telling Tyler everything he needed to know. You're fired. Pack your things and get out. The walk to the locker room felt like a death march. He grabbed his meager belongings, an old shirt, a tattered book, and a photo of his last foster family, a memory of happier days when he was just 7 years old. As he opened his locker to leave, a familiar voice called out, pulling him back. Hey, kid. Charlie Wilson, the old mechanic, stood in the doorway, a thick envelope in his hand. We took up a collection for you. Tyler shook his head. I can't take this. You can and you will, Charlie insisted, a warm smile on his face. You've kept our cars running longer than they should. This is just a little thank you. Tyler hesitated, then accepted the envelope, feeling the weight of it in his hand. Charlie gave him a rough hug. You're better than this place. Go on, get out of here. Tyler left the depot, feeling the cool Portland air against his face. He had nothing left here, but the envelope in his pocket burned with possibility. With no plan and little hope, Tyler found himself standing in front of Sweet Dreams Bakery, where as a child he had longed for the sweet treats he couldn't afford. Today, though, he bought the triple chocolate cake he'd dreamed about for so long. As he walked back to his apartment, the knock on the door startled him. He opened it to find a woman in a tailored coat, her heels clicking against the hallway floor. He almost didn't open it until he saw those unmistakable eyes. Sophia. Her appearance had completely transformed. No more prison jumpsuit. Now she wore designer clothes, her hair styled beautifully. But it was her eyes that remained unchanged, and the gentle curve of her pregnant belly was still there. You look different, Tyler said, stunned. Sophia smiled, settling onto his couch like it was her throne. I promised I'd pay my debt, she said softly. How did you find me? Tyler asked, his mind racing. Money makes anything possible, she replied. And I noticed you were celebrating something. What's the occasion? My firing, Tyler said with a hollow laugh. Guess the kindness didn't pay off. Sophia's smile faltered. It's fortunate I came when I did, then. Let me tell you about karma and justice. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. My father was Marcus Bennett, the real estate mogul who died last year. My stepmother and her son framed me for tax fraud, 3 years in prison. But they didn't know about the safety deposit box my father left me, the one that has everything I need to clear my name. Tyler's eyes widened in shock. Sophia turned to him, her expression softening. You were the only person who showed me kindness when no one else would. Now I need a driver I can trust. Someone who knows the streets of Portland, and someone who understands the finer things in life. The job comes with a very generous salary and perks. Tyler hesitated, looking around his cramped apartment, the life he had built from nothing. "Why me?" "Because you helped me without expecting anything in return," Sophia said softly. "That's rare in my world." She glanced at the cake box in his hands. "Care to share?" Tyler smiled, cutting 2 slices. As they sat down to enjoy the cake, he realized just how much his life was about to change, and that sometimes kindness has a way of finding its way back to you in the most unexpected forms. The cake of destiny. When Tyler finally tasted the cake, it was the sweetest thing he had ever eaten. Or maybe it was the taste of destiny. Morning sunlight streamed through his apartment windows, casting soft beams on the dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of coffee and sizzling bacon filled the space, rousing Sophia from her sleep on the couch. Despite Tyler's insistence, she had refused to leave, choosing to stay in his apartment despite her condition. "Something smells amazing," Sophia called out, her voice muffled by the blanket she had pulled over her head. She followed the delicious aroma into Tyler's tiny kitchen. He was at the stove, expertly flipping pancakes. "I figured after prison food you deserved something real," Tyler said with a grin. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Hayes," Sophia said, settling into his wobbly kitchen chair. "Most of the men I knew before prison couldn't boil water without burning it." Tyler slid a plate in front of her. "Foster care teaches you to be self-sufficient, or you starve." They ate in comfortable silence, the distant hum of morning traffic outside providing a soothing soundtrack. As Sophia sipped her coffee, she studied Tyler, noticing the way his eyes always tracked the room's exits, or how he unconsciously straightened the silverware, habits of someone used to being ready to run. Finally, after a long pause, Sophia stood. "There's something I need to show you. Come downstairs with me." Tyler followed her, curiosity piqued, until they reached the street. His jaw dropped when he saw what was parked in front of his building, a midnight blue Mercedes S-Class. The car gleamed like liquid black, reflecting the morning light. "It's yours," Sophia said, pressing the key fob into his hand. "Consider it back pay for yesterday's fare." Tyler stared at the key, then at the car, and then back at Sophia. His hands trembled slightly. This is too much. I can't accept something like this." "You can, and you will," she said, stepping closer. Her voice was soft but firm. "I've learned that kindness is rarer than diamonds. You showed me kindness when you had nothing, when you were risking everything. Let me do the same for you. Besides," she smiled, rubbing her belly, "I'll need a reliable driver I can trust." Tyler ran his hand along the car's pristine hood, remembering how he used to touch his battered taxi the same way. "I don't even know how to drive something like this. The most expensive thing I've ever driven was that old cab." Sophia smiled mysteriously. "You'll learn." She paused, her gaze warm. "And while you're learning, I might need somewhere to stay until my lawyers finish securing my estate. Your apartment is cozy, but perhaps we could find something more suitable for both of us." Tyler's head spun. Just 24 hours ago, he had been eating bologna sandwiches in a grimy break room. Now, here he was, standing next to a luxury car worth more than he'd ever earned, with a beautiful pregnant woman suggesting they move in together. "Why do I feel like I'm dreaming?" he whispered, the key fob warm in his palm. Sophia squeezed his arm. "Because sometimes, Tyler Hayes, fairy tales do come true, even for taxi drivers and ex-convicts." She glanced at her watch. "Now, shall we take your new car for a spin? I know a great realtor who doesn't ask too many questions." They drove through the city in the sleek Mercedes, and by the end of the day, Tyler was signing paperwork for a mansion, the first step in a new life. A new beginning. A month had passed since the legal battle had ended in Sophia's favor. The mansion's grand fireplace cast flickering shadows across the marble floors that had seen more history than Tyler's entire life. He stood by the window, looking out at Portland's lights twinkling through the evening mist. Sophia stood by the fire, one hand resting on her belly, the other holding a glass of sparkling cider. She looked radiant, a stark contrast to the desperate woman who had once been on the verge of throwing herself under his taxi. "Penny for your thoughts?" Tyler asked, crossing the room to join her. "I was just thinking about paths not taken," she said, setting her glass down on the mantel. "If you hadn't driven that route that day, if you hadn't been released that exact moment, if Howard hadn't fired me." Tyler took her hand. "If my father hadn't been clever enough to arrange that safety deposit box." They both laughed softly, the irony not lost on either of them. What had begun as a game of chance had become a triumphant turn of fate. "I never thanked you properly," Sophia said, her voice soft. "Not just for the ride, but for everything after. For believing in me, for staying when things got complicated, for making me breakfast that morning, for learning to drive this ridiculous house on wheels." Tyler felt a shift within himself. The moment had arrived. He had carried his grandmother's ring, his only family heirloom, in his pocket for days, waiting for the right moment. He knelt, his heart pounding. "Marry me," he said simply. "Let me be a father to your children. Let me spend the rest of my life showing you the kindness you deserve. Let me prove that some fairy tales don't end at midnight." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, catching the firelight like diamonds. For a moment all was still save for the crackling of the flames and the soft ticking of a clock. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes. 1,000 times. Yes." A fairy tale family. The delivery room at Portland General was buzzing with the controlled chaos of childbirth. Tyler paced the sterile hallway, his designer suit rumpled from hours of anxious waiting. Through the double doors, he could hear Sophia's determined breaths as she brought their sons into the world. "Mr. Hayes," a nurse called, "your wife is asking for you." He rushed in, heart in his throat. There she was, exhausted but radiant, cradling 2 tiny bundles, their sons. "Meet James Marcus Hayes and William Charles Hayes," Sophia whispered, her voice raspy from exertion. Tyler's hands shook as he reached out to touch their tiny hands. "They're perfect," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Just like their mother." For the first time, Tyler felt the warmth of family. Real family. He had always dreamed of it, but he never truly thought it would come true. Now, with these 2 perfect boys, he had a family of his own. A family he would cherish, protect, and love. No more prison uniforms, no more taxi meters, no more people trying to steal what's yours, he murmured, his heart full. Just us and our boys. As their sons let out twin wails of protest, Tyler laughed, already reaching for James, while Sophia comforted William. The nurses exchanged knowing smiles. These 2 were naturals. Full circle. A few months later, Tyler stood in the middle of the taxi depot lot, watching Howard Mitchell's face turn ghostly white as he saw the sleek Mercedes pull in. Tyler, wearing a suit that cost more than a month's revenue, stepped out with his usual confident stride. "Welcome to the first inspection under new ownership," Tyler said, his voice carrying across the lot. Howard stumbled backward. I was just leaving," he stammered. "Save it." Tyler cut him off. "Your resignation letter is already on my desk. Charlie's taking over as manager, someone who actually cares about the people here." Charlie Wilson, the old mechanic, approached with tears in his eyes. "Remember when I told you to remember us little people when you made it big?" Tyler embraced him. "You were never little people, Charlie. You were family." And speaking of family, Tyler gestured toward the car where Sophia sat with the twins. "Want to meet your honorary grandsons?" Charlie's face lit up. "Grandkids now? You're talking?" Tyler smiled, watching as his past and present merged, his old co-workers congratulating him, admiring the luxury car, and celebrating his success. The orphan who had once been lonely and lost now had a family, and as he stood there with Sophia and their twins by his side, he knew that life had come full circle. His story had only just begun.